Hey guys, welcome to Unit 8, carrying on in the units, and now we're going to talk about the endocrine system. The endocrine system will probably be familiar to some of you guys, and to other you guys it might be a little bit new, but we'll go through it the same just for both groups. So what is the endocrine system? Well, the endocrine system is made up of a bunch of different glands that are found all throughout your body that ultimately produce hormone. A hormone is a chemical messenger, and I'll get a better definition of that for you in a couple of seconds. But the endocrine system is any tissue or cells of the body that will produce a hormone. The endocrine system is heavily involved in regulation within the body. Okay, hormones have a way of controlling or helping to control most of the body's systems, and therefore it plays a huge role in homeostasis. Now, the endocrine system and the nervous system together, they pair up, and together they have basically total control of the homeostasis within our body. Okay, the nervous system is going to regulate groups of cells, and the nervous system is going to happen really, really quickly, right? That's going to prepare us for that fight or flight syndrome, which can take over in a matter of seconds, or even less than that. The endocrine system, this is going to be the much longer term, the much slower acting system. So the hormones are going to regulate body processes and metabolic activity, and this is the long game. All right. So the endocrine system will have a big effect on growth, reproduction, puberty, metabolism, long-term processes that that don't just happen in the blink of an eye. That's generally the realm of the nervous system. So if we have a look at this slide here, we're going to have a look at some of the glands that make up the endocrine system. Okay, and they're found, like you can see here, throughout the body. We'll go through, just list them off real quick, because we're going to talk about them in more detail as we go through the unit. If we think about the ones that are in the brain, you can see these are tiny groups of cells and glands. The hypothalamus that we spoke about in last unit has a major role to play in the endocrine system. The pineal gland is also in the brain, as well as the pituitary gland, which is also a major player when we're talking about the endocrine system. In the neck, we've got two glands, the thyroid and the parathyroid, which is a smaller gland, basically groups of cells that we find on the surface of the thyroid gland. In the chest, we have the thymus. And this is a gland that we spoke about earlier. We mentioned when we talked about the circulatory system, we talked about T cells, and we'll certainly talk a lot more about T cells when we're talking about immunity. And then if we think about some of the glands that are found in the abdomen, we have kidneys, which are also organs, but they do have they do produce hormones. When we'll have the pancreas, there's certainly lots of hormones produced in the digestive tract. And we have the adrenal glands, and then finally we have the gonads. So the gonads, of course, are the cells or the organs that produce the sex cells in the male and the females. So when we say gonads for the males, we'll talk about the testes. For the females, we'll talk about the ovaries. Now, so what are hormones? Well, a hormone is a chemical messenger that is used to communicate and coordinate throughout the body and the body's systems. They can have an influence on cells and tissues throughout the whole body. There's a few different ways of how they work, and very often in biology you'll hear the word action used for the function. So the action of a hormone is actually what it physiologically does to cause its effect. So some hormones will stimulate the production of enzymes by activating the DNA. So we would say the action of that hormone is to activate DNA to produce enzymes. Okay, so that's one way they can function. They can also change the rate at which an enzyme is produced, and that can have an effect by changing the rate of transcription and translation. If you think back to protein synthesis, of course, enzymes that we use for metabolism are proteins, so it has to go through the process of transcription and translation in order to be produced. So if you have a hormone that controls how fast that enzyme is produced or how slow it's produced, then that can affect the metabolic reaction that enzyme carries out. And another thing that the hormones can do is they can alter the shape of an enzyme to activate it so that the active site becomes functional and it can carry out those reactions, or it can cause the protein to shift shape, which, as you guys know, would cause the enzyme to be inactive and not function. So hormones will only affect the cells and tissues that have receptors for that hormone. So they're a little bit specific on what cells and tissues they can act on. The receptors, which you'll find on the cells and the tissues, they're going to be quite specific to bind with that hormone. Some cells will have a few different receptors for a few different hormones, which means more than one hormone can work on that tissue or those group of cells. And other cells will only have probably the single hormone receptor. Now, this next part is quite important. We have extracellular receptors and we have intracellular receptors. Okay, so remember, these are the receptors that you're going to find on the cells or tissues, and these will bind with the hormones and allow the hormones to have an influence on that cell or tissue. So we have ones that are extracellular, that are on the surface of the cell. So when the hormone comes in contact with the cell membrane, it can find one of those receptors and it can have an effect. We'll also have intracellular receptors. Now, these are the ones that we're going to find inside the cell. So there's going to be a hormone receptor. It's not going to be on the surface of the cell, but it's going to be inside or deep in the cell. So the hormones have to find a way to get into the cell if they're going to function using those type of receptors. And then if the cell doesn't have a receptor, then that hormone won't have any effect on that particular cell. So a receptor has to be present in order for a hormone to function. Now, we've got two different types of hormone receptors, and we've got two different types of hormones, or two classes, sorry. We classify these based on their solubility. So some hormones are soluble in lipids, and some hormones are soluble in water. Okay, the lipid soluble hormones, they're going to be steroid based in composition. Okay, and if you're a lipid soluble hormone, that means you can pass through the cell membrane no problem because you're a lipid, so you can dissolve in lipids. So it's quite easy for a lipid soluble hormone to use an intercellular receptor. So that means it can pass through the cell membrane and bind to a receptor site somewhere inside the cell. It could be on the nucleus, it could be on another organelle, but the receptor is going to be inside the cell. The other class of hormone is going to be the water soluble hormones. These are generally proteins. They're going to be short peptide chains or amine compounds, but they're not lipid soluble. They're not steroid based like the other ones. These water soluble hormones, they're going to find themselves on the extracellular receptors. Okay, so these are the type of hormones that will bind to the receptors that are on the surface of the cell membrane. So these won't be able to enter the cell because they're water soluble, not lipid soluble, so they won't be able to cross the membrane easily. So a water soluble hormone, they're going to cause a reaction that we call a second messenger reaction, and I'll talk to you more about that a little bit later in the unit. And a very common second messenger we have is cyclic AMP, so we often abbreviate it as small c AMP. And like I said, we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail later. Now, hormones, we said, is a chemical messenger, but most of the time they have a function of regulating some effect on metabolism. They can also regulate growth, reproduction, and hormones can have a big change in our behavior as well. So it's accomplished by those hormones being released from the glands initially. So they're produced in a gland, part of the endocrine system. They're released into the bloodstream mostly, and then they travel to the cells that they're going to target. Now those target cells will have receptors on them, either the extracellular receptors that are inside the cell or the intracellular receptors which are on the cell's surface. So the hormones will travel throughout the blood until they come into contact with those receptors. If the receptor is present on the cell, they will bind, and then that's when they can cause their effect. Now, some of the effect, some hormones can have an effect on lots of different tissues. For example, growth hormone has an effect on most tissues and cells in our body. Okay, so when growth hormone is released, it has a major influence on our body. Thyroid hormone is the same thing. It has receptors on lots of our cells, so when it's released from the thyroid, it can have effects throughout the whole body, as is insulin. Okay, insulin, of course, is a hormone that helps us control blood glucose levels. Other hormones are very specific in what they target. So thyroid stimulating hormone, for example, that only affects the cells on the thyroid. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, that's why everyone abbreviates it to ACTH. Again, it's a hormone that only has a very specific a group of target cells. It doesn't cause widespread effects on the body. Now, here is a look at the actions of a lipid-soluble hormone versus a water-soluble hormone. All right, for now, what I want you to focus on is basically just the pictures, okay? The text is going to explain what's happening, step by step. But for now, just have a quick look at how these are different. So let's look at the soluble, the lipid-soluble ones first. So here's our hormone. It comes in from the bloodstream. It easily passes through the cell membrane, and it even passes through, in this case, the nuclear membrane, and it binds down here to the receptor. That's actually going to be inside the nucleus of the cell. So that's our lipid-soluble hormone. It doesn't stop on the surface of the cell. It travels deep into the cell where it finds its receptor, and that's when it can cause its effect. If we look at the next one over here, the water-soluble hormone, you can see that this is quite different. So here's our water-soluble hormone. The first thing you'll notice is it has a receptor on the surface of the cell. Okay, it can't pass through the cell membrane. So what happens? The water-soluble hormone will bind to a receptor on the surface of the cell. So down here we can see where the hormone is bonded to the receptor. When that happens, it doesn't enter the cell, so it can't bind to a target inside the cell. What happens is inside the cell, that receptor will activate a molecule of CAMP, cyclic AMP. And cyclic AMP acts as the second messenger. All right, so if you think about this process, the first messenger is going to be the hormone, the second messenger is going to be the cyclic AMP. And what the cyclic AMP does is the cyclic AMP relays the message. Okay, so this hormone doesn't bind to a receptor inside the cell to cause its effect. It binds to a receptor on the surface of the cell, and then it releases a molecule, the second messenger, called CAMP, which instructs the cell what to do, how to carry out that hormone's function. So those are the two differences between lipid-soluble hormones and water-soluble hormones. And again, this is explaining what we just talked about. So this is the slide again, a little bit more explanation but there's no pictures on this slide. So step by step, the lipid-soluble hormones, it'll bind to proteins and it's carried throughout the bloodstream. Once it reaches its target cell, it can cross the cell membrane by diffusion, and it will connect to a receptor somewhere inside the cell. It could be in the cytoplasm, it could be in the nucleus. Then we have in this case, it's going to be protein production is activated. That's going to be the effect of this hormone. If we look at the water-soluble hormone, this is going to be the one that will activate the second messenger. It's going to circulate freely in the bloodstream, no problems. It'll bind to a receptor on the cell membrane, on the surface, and it produces that second messenger, the CAMP, and that causes the effect within the cell. The next two slides here are basically illustrations of what we just spoke about on the previous two slides. So here's the first and second messenger and then here is the lipid or steroid hormone.